Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third part in our series, There is Hope, where we've been following Jesus through journeys where He's left Galilee. He's had encounters with people who have demonstrated wonderful signs of faith. It's amazing how people show faith whenever they're facing their greatest adversity. And that's just the way we're wired as human beings. Whether it's the woman in Phoenicia, whether it's the centurion, whether it's the deaf man or the blind man, whenever we're desperate and we know, I need supernatural help, they turn to Jesus. And the good news is we can still turn to Jesus, and you don't need to wait until you're desperate. Now, when we ended last time, it was that marvelous place of Caesarea Philippi where Peter made his confession. Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" And he said it exactly right. The answer to the most important question ever, who is Jesus to you? And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responded by telling him, "It wasn't human beings that taught you that, but my Father, which is in heaven." What a marvelous place to be. Now I'm going to pick up the study again, if you will, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 16. In chapter 16, verse 17, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter." He changes his name to Peter. "And on this rock," meaning on this profession of faith that you have now demonstrated so well, "I will build my church. And the gates of Hades," or the afterlife, or the entrance into the afterlife, which is death. So what he's saying is, "And death will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. What he did was he demonstrated that he's given power to the church, that by the church going out and proclaiming this truth of faith and explaining it to other people, He will empower it. And as you go share the good news of Jesus Christ to a lost and dying world, He empowers what you say. And when people respond with true, genuine faith, what's bound here by oaths here on earth will then be recognized and acknowledged in heaven. What a promise, folks. Now there is hope. We have the ability to, as the Bible teaches, we have the ability to go out and share the good news message. We have the ability to go tell the truth, and the Spirit of God will indwell what we're saying and will open blind eyes, like we talked about last time, so that spiritually, their spiritual life will come alive and they will see and they will believe. Now let's go on. Now, when we start in verse 21, there's a whole change. Look at verse 21. "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to His disciples He must go to Jerusalem to suffer." And He goes on and He explains that the people who were really supposed to be teaching and explaining who He was, well, they were the ones that were actually going to persecute Him and kill Him. And we get to verse 22. "Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke Him. 'Never, Lord,' he said, 'this shall never happen to you.' Jesus turned and said to Peter," and this was one of the other passages that noted that He noticed the other disciples were looking on, and He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind," get this, "the things of God, but the things of men." Peter did not mean to be disrespectful. What he was saying was, you're the Christ. You've come to lead the world. Come to set your reign here on earth. And we're so excited, we're not going to let the enemy overwhelm you. But what Peter did not understand was Jesus had to fulfill something else first. Jesus had to fulfill becoming our substitutionary sacrifice. He had to fulfill going to the cross. But Peter, when he would hear these things, he wouldn't listen because it didn't fit into his theology. Now be careful, folks, because there's no hope in your theology. But there's hope whenever we listen to God's Word and we apply it exactly the way He says. Now let's continue on. "Then Jesus said to His disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now he's explaining this before he went to his cross. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory and his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. Now he goes on to explain in a way that we now understand. First, he must go to be offered as a sacrifice, and that will end his first coming. But he continues to explain about when he does come again. And what he's saying is, Peter, don't listen to my words and tell me what you think I said. Listen to my words and follow me. And that's the difference between being someone who says they believe in a Christ, or they believe in the historic Christ, versus a disciple. You know, Jesus describes his children as sheep, and sheep follow, as fishermen, they fish, as warriors who's wearing an army. Well, warriors get out and fight. He never describes one of his children as somebody who is not actively engaged in spiritual warfare. The closest he has to that is the illustration where the children are around the family table and they got their feet under the table, and the father says, after the meal, it's time to go work. And some say, oh, I will, but they don't. And then others, oh, I don't really want to, but they go work in the field. And the illustration is, those who are really his, they go work in the field. They labor in the harvest. Set metaphors aside, they go out and they demonstrate the love of Christ, and they teach others about Christ. Now let's continue on with chapter 17. And this really is now the beginning of the highlight of this whole series. I promised you a mountaintop experience. Here we go, chapter 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and he led them up a high mountain by themselves. Separated from the other apostles, these three got to journey further with him. Now, this mountain, we're assuming, which is close to Caesarea Philippi, we're assuming it's Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a very tall mountain, and it's over 9,000 feet tall. And there's no settlements up there. Nobody lives up there. It's snow-capped much of the year, and it would have been a perfect place for people to have been very desolate and on their own. Verse 2, there he was transfigured before them. What does that mean? Well, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, and they're talking with Jesus. Now, can you imagine that? Here's Moses and Elijah, and they've come back from the dead, and they're talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And while he was yet speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my Son, whom I love, and with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Boy, we've heard that before. We heard that 2.5 years ago when Jesus was crucified, when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. That's exactly what happened. The Spirit came down like a dove, and the same voice saying essentially the same thing. Verse 6, when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So here we go. Peter, he's so bold, and he's really out there, and he speaks his mind, and lots of times his conviction is really good. And in this case, his conviction is good again. He says, Jesus, don't let Moses and Elijah leave. This is the beginning of the millennial reign. This is the beginning of you establishing your kingdom on earth. The prophet said Elijah would come back. There he was, Elijah in the flesh, in his glorified body. Now think about what you had represented there. You have Jesus speaking to Elijah, which is the first major prophet who would be representation of all the prophets. And all the prophets spoke of Jesus. So he's confirming the prophecy in the Old Testament that was speaking about Jesus, this Jesus. And then it's also Moses. And Moses represents the first 5 books known as the law, the Torah. So the law is represented in this meeting. All of the first 5 books and the promise of the creation and everything else that Moses wrote is included in this conversation. What an affirmation. Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the Creator God promised by the prophets. He is the fulfillment. And He allowed these 3 disciples to get just a glimpse of Him in His glorified body. And it was a horrendous scene. But yet it was so marvelous, it was so supernatural that as it began to end, as it was drawing near an end, Peter jumps up and says, no, we can't stop now. Listen, they need to stay. Lord, let me build temporary shelters. Let me put tents together for all 3 of you. We just want this to continue on. We want the millennial reign to start right now. And Jesus said, Peter, you don't know what you're talking about. And when He noticed the other 2 disciples were somehow being impacted, then He rebukes him. He says, you're not interested in my plans, Peter. You're interested in your plans. My friend, what is your answer today? Are you more interested in finding out how Jesus fits into your plans? Or are you interested in knowing how you appropriately fit into His plans? The door is open. You've been extended a welcome into the plan of God. He describes His church as lively stones. He's the head cornerstone, and the church is built of lively stones, meaning you are that lively building block in His church. And He's inviting you to become a part of His plan. There is hope. Jesus will return. That's what the Mount of Transfiguration is all about. Jesus will return in all of His glory, and when He does, there will be no enemies that stand up against Him. He will be great. He will be victorious. He will fight His battles all by Himself, and He will not even be threatened in the process. Those disciples are so excited about when Jesus comes, wrongs are going to be made right. Hope is going to be overflowing like that supernatural river that will come out of the throne of God in the millennial temple. There is hope, folks. And what He's saying is, I give you just a little glimpse of it. And now you and I have the recorded event affirm that Jesus is who He says He is. And Jesus will fulfill His promises of coming back to reign. You can look for this. You know, there's one more thing I want to encourage you about. Jesus taught a parable. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like this. A husband is getting ready to come back to get his bride. After the home is built and he's secured a place for her, and she has all of her bridesmaids. And they know it's drawing near because they see the signs. They hear about he's almost done, he's almost done. And they're told to be waiting, to be looking, and be prepared. Because as soon as he shows up, the bridal party is going to start, and here we go. But when he shows up, some of the bridal party is ready, and they've had lamps because he showed up at night and they were ready to go. But some was saying, oh, well, I didn't know it was tonight and I've already used up my oil, or I need a new wick. And He's very, very curt about them. And what He's saying is, those who are looking for my return, let's go. But for those who play the game, for those who are not anxiously awaiting, He says that those who are truly His will not be surprised because they're always looking for His return. Folks, there's hope. And I want to encourage you to today, be one of those people with that great hope. Jesus in His glorified body, and He gives us just a glimpse. My friend, you, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you too will have a glorified body. And you're going to have stories to tell. I trust that this is encouraging to you. I trust you're as excited about this as I am. And I just want to encourage you. Dig into God's Word. Take just those 2 chapters that we've read in Matthew. Digest them. Make them part of who you are. And let this be your story as you anticipate the return of Jesus Christ. Until next time, there is hope.